I don't lead the most thrilling life, but when people ask for a scary story, this is the one I tell. I was 15 at the time, about to start my sophomore year of high school. I grew up in a typical beach town, packed with tourists in the summer, but a ghost town once the season ended. The bars and restaurants all closed, leaving just locals, the sky, and the ocean. If you've never visited the shore during the off-season, I'd strongly recommend it. It's one of the strangest yet most calming feelings life can offer. As cliche as it sounds, our house was on Surf Avenue, just a block from the beach. Fittingly, I do know how to surf. It'd be pretty pathetic to live on a street named Surf Avenue otherwise. I'd spent my entire childhood there, so the boardwalk and sand were part of my daily routine, practically part of my identity. I don't live in that house anymore, but it's still family-owned, so it feels like a piece of me lingers. Back then, I was on my high school's varsity cross-country team and borderline obsessive about staying in shape, even off-season. Summers at the shore get sweltering, so I'd run super early or late at night, times when I wouldn't melt or dodge crowds. That night, I ended up on a late run. I'd stayed up too late with friends and slept in, so I had no choice. I never brought my phone. No music was annoying, but even the extra weight threw me off. I used this clunky Garmin watch, do they even make those anymore, to track distance and pace. The only other thing I carried was my house keys. My parents were fanatical about locking up, even if they were home. Stuffing keys into my shorts was non-negotiable. I still don't get why. Beach towns are safe, but rules are rules. I stuck to the boardwalk that night. The surface was soft enough to be easy on my legs, but not as punishing as sand. Sometimes I'd run the beach for a challenge, but after the day I'd had, I just wanted a flat, mindless jog. After a few miles, I zoned into that runner's high, push past the first mental barrier, around mile 3, and the rest feels almost euphoric. I focus on the slap of my shoes against the wood and the distant crash of waves. Then I heard it, a faint clink. I stopped, checked my pocket, empty. My stomach lurched. The keys. I crouched, squinting to the boardwalk gaps, but it was pitch black underneath, cursing loudly. Adrenaline's a hell of a drug. I jumped down to the sand. Pride played a role too. I couldn't abandon my keys. The stench on the boardwalk hit me. Rotten seaweed and stale beer, like a bathtub filled with both. My watch's dim backlight barely helped as I sifted sand and trash. Nothing. Frustrated, I crawled back up and had a genius idea. Use my shoelace as a marker. I untied it, slipped it through the planks, and as I stood, yank. Something pulled it down. My blood froze. Someone was under there, maybe with my keys. Our address was etched on them. I couldn't let a stranger have that. Stupid teenage confidence took over. I crawled back under, the air now suffocating. Shuffling echoed around me, not from one spot, but multiple. Reality hit. Fighting crackheads here was suicide. I turned to leave, but a cold hand grabbed my ankle. I screamed, kicked blindly, and scrambled out, sprinting home. My dad answered, furious until he saw the gashes on my ankle. The police came, locked for change. For days, things felt normal until a knock woke me at dawn. No one was there except my shoelace on the mat. We installed a security system that afternoon. Nothing else happened, but even now, I can't rationalize it. That house isn't mine anymore, but knowing a stranger knows its location still creeps me out.
It was around midnight that I heard the noise first indistinct, rather like a light knock issuing from the ceiling. I paid little heed to it, merely putting it down to an old apartment building's settling creaks and groans, to which I had grown accustomed in the near year that I had been living there. That night was different. I sat on my couch, binge-watching a series, headphones in, with the world tuned out. Then, again, came this hollow, calculated knock. This time, it was louder, and it wasn't from above. It was coming from my door. I paused the show, holding my breath. The screen of my phone blinked at 12:03 a.m. Nobody should knock this time of night. I stayed still a second, listening. My heart was pounding. After a few minutes of silence, I convinced myself it must have been one of the neighbors off to work late or just some other random noise that I heard incorrectly. But the instant I went back to my show, there it was again, this time 3 knocks, slow and spaced out, almost too intentional. I went over to the door, planted my ear against the peephole, and saw nothing. The hallway was dimly lit, all the lights flickering on and off. My stomach turned a nervous somersault. Who knocks and then just leaves? I tried shaking off the creeping anxiety, telling myself I was overreacting. But the subsequent nights, it didn't stop. Same happening every time. Knock, followed by nothing. And every time I opened up, nobody was there. I began becoming paranoid. My apartment was on the 5th floor, and the only way up was either the elevator or via the staircase at the far end of the hall. I'd hear them if they left. I decided to wait it out one night. I sat on the couch in the dark and watched the door. It happened again just after midnight, 3 knocks. My heart raced. I had jumped up, turned the handle, and pulled the door open without looking through the peephole. But this time, the hallway wasn't empty. Someone was standing at the end, just barely visible in the shadows near the staircase. I couldn't make out their face, but they were tall, wearing a hooded jacket. They didn't move, didn't say a word. Just stood there, staring. I froze, feeling my skin crawl. Then, wordlessly, they turned and went down the stairs. I slammed the door shut, locking every bolt. My hands were shaking and my mind raced. Who was that? Why did they knock on my door every night? What did they want? I called building management the next day. They looked at the security cameras. There was nothing out of the ordinary. No person went near my door around the times that I said. They said that I must have just imagined it, or heard it from another floor. But I know what I saw. They stopped knocking that night, but I am still uneasy in my house. Every creak, every soft sound in the middle of the night makes my heart start racing. I never saw that person again, but I keep wondering. Was he really gone? Or is he just waiting for the right moment to show up again? It happened a few years ago, but I still remember every detail as if it happened yesterday. It was a typical Friday night, and I was home alone. My roommate, Jess, had gone to visit her parents for the weekend, so I had the whole place to myself. Our apartment was in a quiet neighborhood, one of those areas where nothing much ever happens. I was looking forward to a weekend of binge-watching shows and maybe a bit of self-care. I was in the living room, sprawled on the couch, with a bowl of popcorn on my lap and some random TV show playing in the background. It was around 10 p.m. when I first noticed it, a strange feeling, like I was being watched. At first, I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I glanced over at the window, but the curtains were drawn, and everything seemed normal. A few minutes later, I heard a faint noise coming from the backyard. It sounded like something rustling, like the wind blowing through the leaves. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was probably just a raccoon or some stray animal. But the noise kept going, steady and persistent. I muted the TV and listened closely. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. Slow, deliberate steps, moving closer to the house. My heart started racing, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I got up from the couch, tiptoeing to the window, and slowly pulled back the curtain, just enough to peek outside. There was a man standing in my backyard. He was facing away from the house, just standing there, still as a statue. He was tall, wearing dark clothes, and had his hands in his pockets. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. What was he doing there? I quickly let the curtain fall back into place, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Maybe he was just lost, or maybe he was a neighbor, but why was he just standing there, not moving? I decided to wait it out, hoping he would leave. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a coincidence, a random passerby. But then I heard the footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, like he was pacing back and forth. I couldn't help myself. I had to look again. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking. The operator picked up, and I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained what was happening. She told me to stay on the line, and that a patrol car would be there soon. I felt a little relieved, but the fear was still gnawing at me. I kept my eyes on the window, watching for any sign of movement. This time, he was closer to the house, almost directly in front of the window. I couldn't see his face clearly, but he seemed to be looking straight at me, through the curtain. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. A few minutes passed, and the footsteps stopped. I felt a surge of hope, maybe he had left. But then I heard something else, a soft tapping, like fingers drumming on glass. I looked up and saw a silhouette standing just outside the window. The curtains were thin, and I could make out the shape of his face, his nose almost touching the glass. He was staring right at me. I stumbled back, dropping the phone. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed a kitchen knife, my hands trembling, and ran to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, the tapping echoing in my head. Then, everything went quiet. I don't know how long I stood there, gripping the knife, waiting for something to happen. It felt like hours, but it was probably just a few minutes. I heard the distant sound of a siren approaching, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. When the police arrived, they searched the yard and the surrounding area but found no trace of the man. They told me it was probably just a prowler, someone looking for an easy target. They assured me they'd keep an eye on the neighborhood, but the look in their eyes told me they weren't convinced it was that simple. I never saw the man again, but for weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. I moved out of that apartment a few months later, but I still get chills whenever I hear footsteps in the dark or a faint tapping on the window. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, and I guess I never will. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone, I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, waiting for the right moment to come back. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway. My wife, Emily, and I needed a break, a chance to escape the city noise, the stress of work, and the endless buzz of daily life. We booked a cozy cabin about 2 hours away, nestled in the woods by a serene lake. Just us, nature, and a weekend of peace. The drive up was smooth, almost too smooth. I remember thinking how quiet the roads were for a Friday evening. It was eerie but also refreshing, no traffic, no distractions. As we wound through the forest, the GPS flickered, losing signal here and there, but we had the direction saved. The cabin was isolated, tucked away from any neighboring houses. That was the appeal, after all, no people, just silence. When we arrived, the air was cool, the sun setting behind the thick trees, casting long shadows across the gravel driveway. I killed the engine, and for the first time in weeks, I felt calm. Emily grabbed the keys from the visor and went ahead to unlock the door while I unloaded the bags. That's when I noticed it. There was a pair of boot prints in the dirt, large, heavy, and fresh. They led up to the front steps of the cabin. My first thought was maybe the caretaker had come by to check on the place before we arrived, but something about the size of the prints. I don't know, they just stuck with me. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was nothing. The cabin was exactly like the pictures online, rustic, clean, simple. but the silence inside was unnerving. We set down our things, and I tried to shake the feeling, but the hairs on the back of my neck stayed on edge. Emily noticed it too. We laughed it off as city paranoia. That night, after a glass of wine and a fire crackling in the hearth, we both began to relax. The night air was cool, and the only sounds outside were the chirping crickets and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Around midnight, we headed to bed. That's when the real unease started. Sometime in the night, I woke up to the faintest sound. At first, I thought it was a dream, a soft creaking, like footsteps on the porch. I held my breath, trying to listen. Nothing. Emily was still asleep beside me, so I convinced myself it was just an animal passing by. But then I heard it again, closer this time, right outside the door. A shuffle, a scrape against the wood. My heart was racing now. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could and crept to the window, pulling the curtain back just a fraction. There was nothing. Just the empty porch, bathed in moonlight. I went back to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching. I lay awake for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. Then, just as I started to drift off again, there was a loud bang, like something heavy had slammed into the side of the cabin. Emily shot up, her eyes wide with panic. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, my throat dry. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and motioned for her to stay put. Slowly, I moved through the cabin, my footsteps barely making a sound on the wooden floor. I checked the windows, the doors, everything was locked, but that didn't make me feel any better. Outside, the wind had picked up, howling through the trees. I peered through the kitchen window, my hand shaking slightly as I raised the flashlight. The beam swept across the porch and then, it caught something. A figure, just standing there at the edge of the tree line, motionless. I froze. It was too far to make out any details, but it was definitely a person. Just standing, staring at the cabin. I didn't wait. I rushed back to the bedroom, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911. No signal. Of course. We didn't pack. We didn't grab anything. We just bolted for the car. The flashlight barely cut through the darkness, and every rustle in the bushes made my heart race faster. I cursed under my breath and grabbed Emily's hand. "We're leaving. Now." I fumbled with the keys, and for a moment, I was convinced whoever, or whatever, it was would grab us before we could get inside. Finally, I got the car started. The headlights blazed to life, sweeping across the trees, and the figure was gone. I floored it, gravel spitting out behind us as we sped down the dirt road, not stopping until we hit the main highway. We never found out who that person was or what they wanted. We called the property owner the next morning, and he claimed no one should have been out there. No other cabins. No neighbors. I still think about that night sometimes, about how close we were to something, or someone. To this day, I don't know if it was just some local messing with us, or something far more sinister. But I do know one thing, we'll never go back to that cabin. Some places just aren't meant to be peaceful.